Hello and welcome to this Chapter 2 presentation on biological beginnings, where I'm going to be looking at, right, this story of the human being and where it starts, and stepping back a little bit and looking at how humans are actually part of this broader story of biological life, and then what is the unique sort of human condition. So we're going to be looking at conception, but I want to sort of start with the first part of the presentation, looking at setting the groundwork a little bit. Hope you're doing well. Grab a coffee or whatever, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Talking about, these are some of the biggest questions, like who are we? Who will we become? What makes us change throughout our lives? Like, why do we grow old in the way that we do, and how do we understand things like aging and maturation, and why do we like certain things and not other things, and why do we have to die? Why do you that's a tough one, but what makes some people better at things than others? Sorry, this thing, I'll change that light. I tried to have some cool lights in the background, but that's flashing way too fast. I won't do that for the whole presentation. Um, and yeah, we're gonna start in this presentation like right at conception, and basically this idea of uh, of human development starting there, and starting with this genetic inheritance from our ancestors.
Life. With an estimated 3.8 billion years of existence and evolution on Earth, it's an odd thing indeed. So how did we get here? And what would the Earth's 4.5 billion year timeline look like compressed into a normal day of 24 hours? The story begins early in the morning, around 4 a.m., with the rise of the first simple, single-celled organisms. However, these organisms are destined to spend quite some time alone. At 1 p.m., a simple cell engulfs another, creating a symbiotic relationship and the first eukaryotic cells, or cells with internal organs. At 6:30 p.m., these cells begin to form colonies, and thus the first multicellular life develops. But it isn't until 8:30 p.m. that sea plants appear, and 20 minutes later we suddenly see animal life erupt in an explosion of inventiveness. Jellyfish, the first true vertebrates, trilobites. Incredible diversification begins to take place, and just before 10 p.m., plants begin to appear on land, followed by land mammals. By 1024, the Earth is covered in carboniferous forests, and the first winged insects appear. Many reptiles dominate the land with less than an hour left, but a mass extinction event allows dinosaurs to storm the scene and remain until 11:41 p.m. when they too suddenly vanish. And so begins the age of mammals. In the last few minutes, apes split from the old world monkeys, and with only 1 minute and 17 seconds left before midnight, humans emerge. All of the recorded human history fits within a few seconds, an individual life lasting barely an instant. All a culmination of 3.8 billion years of life. This ASAP Science video was made possible by the support of Audible.com. With their help, we're able to continue making fun science videos, and they want to give you a free audiobook. Audible is the internet's leading provider of audiobooks with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all different types of literature, including fiction, nonfiction, and periodicals. Just go to audible.com/ASAP to get a free audiobook of your choice. Today's episode was inspired by the book A Short History of Nearly Everything, in which Bill Bryson explores the neatest bits of science, my personal recommendation. Again, just head over to audible.com/ASAP to download it for free, or another audiobook of your choice. And subscribe for more weekly science videos.
I think it's pretty easy for us to understand that we're influenced by the genetic inheritance of our parents, right? And it's even pretty straightforward to think that, okay, well, it's obviously not just your parents that contribute to your genetics, it's also like their parents and everybody actually in their parents, and you start building out these family trees, and you realize that, like, you actually have potentially thousands of generations of ancestors. And that even with that long history of humanity, humans are relatively recent on the planet, like even just compared to other mammals. And yet our DNA is so directly linked with other life forms that like we share the DNA of the very first eukaryotes, the very first multi-cell organisms, right? That's like a wild point, that we carry all of this surviving DNA in our own. And that you'll hear people say, like, this is where it's so kind of complicated, and it's like everyone knows what DNA has heard DNA, that you might even know that stands for like a actual chemical, and this is like almost nomenclature, like deoxyribonucleic acid. And it's like, okay, well, it's like this. And this is where it's like everyone knows it. When you actually think about it, it's pretty wild that there's this like coded information that's in your blood and your DNA throughout your body that's directing all these kind of underlying biological processes. I say that we share 50% of our DNA with the banana, and that usually makes students like kind of laugh. But then you gotta realize, like, we're both life forms, right? Both carbon-based life forms, both. There's similarities in the basic building blocks of life on Earth. Yeah, that what makes us human isn't necessarily the specific chemical composition of the compounds that make up your body, but it's the combination, it's the arrangement of the DNA, it's the specific coding in the genetic inheritance that is specifically human. Homo sapiens sapien, that's what we are. You say sapien twice because the second sapien is, anyways, maybe I'll save that for a different discussion. Okay, but everyone that's on the planet right now is a Homo sapiens sapien. And I'll just say that, I guess, that like the Homo sapiens sapien, the second, you guys are like, why does he keep saying this? The second time you say sapien sort of signifies this idea that we think that somewhere between sort of 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, there was this massive leap in brain power, basically. Despite sharing the same DNA as billions, I could have wrote that more clearly, but basically, even though we each have similar DNA, and all humans have, not to get too hugely off base, but like we all have genetic traces back to some of the earliest humans. And despite that, your DNA is also completely uniquely you, and is in some ways the most uniquely you thing in the world. It like literally obviously is you. It's the code that directed your development from like the nature side of the equation. It's your DNA that makes you who you are. And this course is like constantly coming back to this nature versus nurture thing, right? And again, you've heard me rant about already, and I'll do it a bunch of times, how it's not nature or nurture. The real question is like, how are they coexist? Like, what's the interaction here between nature and nurture? And this has been what psychology has been forced to deal with from biology, basically, this understanding that DNA actually plays a huge role, that we actually have this, like, I said to my class the other day at Conestoga College, I was talking about DNA, and I was saying that if you had never heard the concept, just pretend you grew up and for whatever reason, no one that you grew up around believed in DNA or had ever even heard of it. And I told you that inside your blood, there was, at a really small level on that, there's these things that we call genes, and in the genes there was these like chromosomes, and there was information stored on those, and that information actually directed really significant things about your development, not just things like if you have freckles or what color your hair is, but also things around like intelligence, and maybe even things like, athletic ability and sense of humor, and maybe even things like tendency towards having a temper, something that we consider very behavioral, like that it's one thing to think that we pass genetically things that are like physical traits. It's a whole other thing to think that, a behavior might pass generations, or a tendency towards a behavior. And I'll talk about that. That general topic is called behavioral genetics, and it's fascinating. All right, but this idea that humans, the story of humanity is the story of you, and humans have been around for a long time, and that their experiences have been hardwired into their DNA, that DNA that's in you. Like, to say that your ancestors live in you, quite literally in the composition of your DNA. It's not like literally their blood, because DNA doesn't work that way. It's not like literally their DNA, it's a copy of their DNA. Everything's a copy, right? That like you have, when, and again, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but when the male sperm and the egg prepare to, like, there's this separation that happens first so that the copy of each can be combined. We're going to call that recombination, or fertilization of the egg is the way that you say it. But that's like a fascinating idea. And so it's like a copy of mom and dad's DNA that get combined. And that's why siblings are different, because sometimes those copies come together differently. That's one of the reasons they're different. And when there's an error in that copying, you might find it interesting that that's what the word mutation basically means. When there's an error in the copying of the genetic code. And mutations could be serious things like health defects, or health like conditions, or it can be more neutral things like red hair color or blue eyes. Okay. Darwin. He ranks right up there with Freud in terms of like people that are often referred to and what's the way to say it? Like often cited but rarely understood. Darwin's an interesting guy because he often gets presented as like being kind of against religion, right? Because he had a huge impact on religion at a deep level, right? Like you probably, if you know Darwin, you associate him likely with the idea of evolution, obviously, because that's clearly his most famous idea. It might be interesting for you to know that he kind of started studying child development. He found that he was actually highly interested in child development. Darwin was so interesting, right? The history, because like he came up with these ideas of evolution and then came back to England, and he was like a relatively anxious and shy person, and so he had all these ideas and he needed somebody to debate. There was this famous debate, Huxley versus Wilberforce, and you might be wondering why neither of those names are Darwin. I'm going a little bit off topic, but you might find this interesting. Maybe the best debate of all time. Think of it like an old school battle rap. This happened in like a library where people were like probably drinking beer, and where it was like this debate over is it God or evolution, and the church sent Wilberforce, who was like their heavyweight in terms of speech, and Darwin sent Huxley. And if you've heard the name Huxley before, you might be thinking of Aldous Huxley, like the person that wrote Brave New World. It was actually his grandpa, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, his grandpa, Thomas Huxley, was nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog because he was this like younger guy, super like charismatic, amazing speaker, and he basically like kind of pushed some of Darwin's ideas. I don't know why I felt the urge to tell you that right there, but Darwin thought that humans evolved. If there's a more loaded sentence, and especially at the time when he was writing that, and he thought that like what basically happened is, and again, just one point that's important is saying that humans evolved is not the same as saying that humans came from monkeys, that we didn't come from monkeys, we didn't come from chimps. If we came from chimps, why would there still be chimps? It's saying that humans evolved from the human species evolves. That demands a look at what the word evolution means and what the word development means and the difference. And this is probably interesting to you because this is like a developmental psychology course, and development and evolution are two parts of the same story. Over thousands of years, humans evolve. Things happen, things change in the species. Within one lifetime, you develop. So it's almost like evolution is the long frame picture, and each organism in that chain of evolution also has their own developmental cycle. And if it's a chain of evolution, the idea is that like, yeah, it's just kind of, sorry, I got a bit rambly there, but it's kind of interesting how the words development and evolution, things evolve over time, but within each individual life, that organism goes from birth to death, and we call the birth to death sort of your development, right? So in developmental psychology, we study like the process of aging. So anyways, Darwin, sorry that I've been getting a bit ranty on this slide. I can tell I'm like 5 minutes in and I haven't even made any of my points yet, really. That he thought that basically what happens is that people are pressured by situations, and that and he came up with his idea studying like finches, and which is a type of bird, and other animals. So he was saying this isn't unique to humans, that pressure is exerted in the environment. He reasoned that because of this intense struggle for things like food and water and other resources, that the young of each generation need to compete to survive. And some will compete better based on the situation. So for example, say if, let's just not use humans for a second, let's talk about, say, like baby rabbits. And say there's like 10 different baby rabbits. Darwin had this interesting idea that, okay, what if all those rabbit babies were the exact same? And what if they all were like kind of sensitive to heat? And what if it was an incredibly hot summer for whatever reason, and then like all those rabbits die? That it seemed like nature doesn't do that. What nature does is the siblings are different. And especially in prey animals, especially in something like a rabbit. So there's a whole bunch of babies, and the babies have different qualities, different combinations, different recombinations of the genetic material of the parents, so that maybe the first baby is faster, the second baby can go longer without food, the other baby is more brave, the other one's better at hiding. And what it does is it creates a scenario where in an unpredictable world, hopefully at least a few of the offspring have the skill set needed to survive. That they're, for whatever reason, their genetics and their environment are a fit. And when that fit is the best, they're most likely to survive. And that's actually what survival of the fittest means. That it doesn't mean the survival of the strongest, because being the fittest might mean being able to go the longest without food, or being able to go a long time without water, or being able to hide well when under threat, being able to freeze. Like remember, I'm talking about baby rabbits. So this idea that, and he thought that those kind of pressures were around the evolution of all kinds of stuff. He thought, like I say, that evolution determines how we perceive the world, how we speak, how we behave. That it has this deep, and it's kind of the argument here is that, like, obviously you're not the first human, and would you think that none of the humans before influence you? And it's sort of easier to think of how they would influence us physically, and it's a little harder to think of how they would influence us in terms of how we process things like stress, or how we behave, or what we're, all these complex, I was going to say, like, what we're afraid of or what we're attracted to. It's like all these complexities of human psychology. Yeah, future generations will result from their own evolution well, I mean, I think that's kind of a weird way of writing it, but just this idea of, I like to say this to students, is if you have kids yourself, you're going to be eventually, excuse me, if you have kids yourself and they have kids and they have kids and their kids have kids, and like that kind of chain, it's like you're eventually going to be in the ancestor family tree of future people. And this is where we're going to get into another interesting concept in this course of epigenetics, that, like, if I'm saying that experience of your ancestors somehow affects you, that's sort of also implying that your experience somehow affects them. And I apologize, this slide's all of a sudden been 9 minutes. Maybe, me maybe drinking too much coffee while pre-recording this is making me a bit ranty, but I don't know. I hope you found that rant kind of interesting.
Mechanisms of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. Evolution, then, is the answer to the question that we have all asked on seeing a Dachshund and a Great Dane together. How is it possible for ancestors to have descendants that look so very different to them? In answering this question, we want to focus on animals, excluding other forms of life such as fungi and plants. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity, and, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique, and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. So what is the reason for these differences? Let's take a closer look at a creature. Every creature is made up of cells. These cells have a nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromosomes, and the chromosomes hold the DNA. DNA consists of different genes, and it's these genes that are life's information carriers. They contain instructions and orders for the cells and determine the characteristics and traits that living creatures have. And it's precisely this DNA that is unique to every creature. It's slightly different from individual to individual, which is why each has slightly different characteristics. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants, as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The second recombination occurs when a male inseminates a female. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects, such as the blue eye color in humans, which is one such random mutation. In all cases, a mutation has to affect a gamete, that is, a sperm or egg cell, because only the DNA in the gametes is passed on to the offspring. This is also the reason why we protect our sexual organs during X-rays, whilst other parts of the body are not at risk. In summary then, in the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA, so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. There's a key word here: random. All of these processes are based on chance. Random recombination and mutations result in individuals with random mixes of traits and characteristics, which in turn mix these randomly and pass them on. But how can so much be down to chance when all living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their environment? For example, the stick insect, the hummingbird, and the frogfish. The answer is provided by the second key point: selection. Each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics. This is why diversity is so important. This is why creatures make so much effort to produce offspring that are as different as possible. They increase the likelihood that at least one of their offspring passes nature's selection process. They maximize their chances of survival. A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin finches, after their discoverer, Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. The differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution. Through the interaction of unique individuals, the excess production of offspring, recombination and mutation in heredity, and finally, through selection. Why is this so important? It tells us where the variety of life comes from and why living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their habitats. But it also affects us personally. Every person is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. And that includes you. Your ancestors fought and adapted in order to survive. This survival was an extremely uncertain thing. If we consider the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever lived are extinct, then you can consider yourself part of a success story. The dinosaurs have disappeared, but you are alive, watching this video. Because you're incredibly special, just like all the other creatures that exist today. Irreproducible and unique in the universe.
I apologize for that one bear part. And if you were watching that video, you likely know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know, I think that video is awesome, and hopefully you laughed at that and didn't find it too weird. It was weird. If I could easily clip that out or something. I don't know why they decided to go that direction with that scene, but anyways, usually in class, if I'm showing that video, I'll be like, hey, look over here or something. One time I like ran and tried to jump in front of the screen, but then it just like kind of projected on me. So then it was like, I was like trying to block it, but then it was just, you could almost just see the same video just right on my shirt. But I thought that video was really good at showing this idea of recombination and the idea of what mutation is, and also why randomness is so important, right? And it kind of, I hopefully showed in a lot more kind of clear of a way what I was trying to rant about like my bunny example, right? Like I should have just sort of let that one do the example, but I think hopefully you get the point. So if you could have this is a pretty good way to say it, I think. Natural selection is this evolutionary process by which those individuals of a species best adapted to their environment are the one most likely to survive and reproduce. This is the other piece. So Darwin has basically this idea, right? And lots of people talk about natural selection, but then there's also sexual selection, he said, was like another huge thing, right? So it's not only about reaching sexual maturity, it's also about reaching sexual maturity and being a desirable mate, you know. And again, remember, I'm not just talking about humans, that those two things, getting to sexual maturity and being a desirable mate, whatever that means depending on what species we're talking about, are associated with how genetic material either is or isn't passed on within a species. Part 1 completed. This was more video heavy. I'm gonna get into part 2, and I just gonna break these up so they're a little bit smaller videos to process and stuff like that. But I'll be coming part 2 shortly. Hope you're having a good day, and hopefully that was at least kind of interesting. See you soon.